I thought my aunt was overly cautious when she warned, "If your future in-laws ask for money, never refuse verbally. Tell them to put it in writing." It felt cruel to a bride-to-be. I never imagined that one sentence would detonate a Boston wedding and make a controlling woman walk straight into a trap forged by her own greed. Some people only reveal their true faces when forced to write down exactly what they intend to take from you. My name is Josephine Gray. At 34 years of age, I made a living out of managing disasters. As the Director of Crisis Communications at Astor Point Advisory in Boston, my daily life was a relentless parade of public scandals, corporate embezzlements, and ruined reputations. I was the person wealthy people called when their perfect facades began to crack, when the mistress spoke to the press, or when the offshore accounts were suddenly audited. Because my professional life was steeped in deception, I wanted so desperately to believe in the flawless surface of my own romance. I had recently accepted a marriage proposal from Theo Hargrove. Theo was a man who seemed entirely untouched by the ugly realities I dealt with every single day. He was a successful architect, elegant, impossibly calm, and undeniably handsome. He carried himself with the quiet, unassuming confidence of old Boston money, a pedigree that whispered rather than shouted. His family, the Hargroves, were the kind of people whose names appeared on museum benefactor lists and charity gala invitations. They were, by all outward appearances, completely proper, residing in a world of inherited manners and muted wealth. The evening of our engagement party was a masterclass in tasteful celebration. There were no excessive displays of wealth, only the soft clinking of heavy crystal glasses, the warm glow of candlelight reflecting off polished silver, and the polite murmur of well-connected guests. Moving effortlessly through this curated perfection was Theo's mother, Vivian Hargrove. Vivian was a woman whose elegance bordered on the suspicious. Not a single strand of her silver blonde hair was ever out of place, and her smiles were dealt out with the precision of a seasoned card dealer. She welcomed me into their fold with an embrace that felt wonderfully warm at the time, smelling faintly of expensive jasmine and old wealth. She kissed my cheek and called me the daughter she had always prayed for. But not everyone was charmed by the jasmine and the crystal. 2 days after the engagement party, I received a summons from my aunt. Judge Naomi Mercer did not invite people over. She summoned them. Aunt Naomi was my mother's sister, a woman who had spent 40 years on the bench dissecting human flaws with the emotional detachment of a surgeon. When she asked me to come to her private study in her Beacon Hill apartment, I knew I was not going there to drink tea and look at bridal magazines. Her apartment was exactly like her courtroom. Everything in the room, from the heavy mahogany desk to the leather-bound law books lining the walls, was perfectly organized, resembling a legal file that had already been stamped with a final verdict. There was no clutter, no warmth, only sharp angles, cold facts, and the faint smell of lemon polish. Naomi sat behind her desk, hands folded neatly over a pristine blotter. She did not waste time with small talk. She never did. "I do not oppose this marriage. Josephine," Naomi began, her voice smooth and level, devoid of any celebratory inflection. "Theo seems like a perfectly adequate young man, but I do not trust that family. I do not trust the aesthetic of absolute perfection." I sighed, sinking slightly into the stiff leather armchair opposite her. "Aunt Naomi, you have spent too many years looking at criminals. The Hargroves are good people. Vivian has been incredibly welcoming to me. They are just a nice, traditional family." "Vivian Hargrove is a woman who wears her manners like a suit of armor," Naomi countered sharply, not missing a beat. "She is too smooth, too polished. People who invest that heavily in their outward appearance usually have something utterly rotten hiding underneath it. Honest people do not need to try that hard to look good." "You are being paranoid," I said, my voice rising defensively. "You are judging them without knowing a single thing about their lives." Naomi leaned forward. She did not offer a long, meandering lecture. She did not raise her voice to match mine. She simply looked me dead in the eye and delivered a single piece of advice, striking like a gavel on solid wood. "If they are genuine, paperwork will not scare them. If they get angry over paperwork, it is no longer family affection, it is an agenda. I frowned, the words hanging in the quiet air of the study. It felt like a sudden drop in temperature. "What exactly are you talking about?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. Naomi pulled a sleek gray cardboard folder from her top drawer and slid it across the polished mahogany surface. "I want you to sign a prenuptial agreement. Furthermore, I want ironclad documentation regarding the property in Brookline." She was referring to the 3-story house my grandmother had left me. It was a beautiful, historic property with bay windows and a sprawling garden, entirely paid off, and worth a substantial sum in the current real estate market. It was my sanctuary, my financial safety net, and my only real tie to my late mother's side of the family. "You will keep that house entirely separate," Naomi instructed, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "And you will absolutely never use that asset to help the family without consulting a lawyer first. Not for a business venture, not for a bridge loan, not to cover a sudden tax bill, not for anything." I stared at the gray folder resting between us. A hot wave of irritation washed over me, flushing my cheeks. I felt as though she was dragging something pristine and beautiful through the mud of legal paranoia. I was a bride preparing for a wedding, enveloped in the intoxicating haze of new love, and here was my aunt, treating my future in-laws like potential fraudsters plotting a heist. "This is ridiculous," I snapped, standing up abruptly. "I am marrying Theo. We are building a life together. You are making it sound like I am entering a hostile corporate merger. You are ruining the romance of this with your dry, cynical legalese. Theo loves me. Romance is for poets. Josephine. Marriage is a contract," Naomi replied coldly, her posture rigid. "Take the folder." I took it, mostly to end the suffocating conversation, and left the Beacon Hill apartment feeling a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. That evening, wrapped in the comforting warmth of Theo's arms on my living room sofa, I told him about the meeting. I expected him to laugh it off, to dismiss Naomi as an eccentric old judge who saw shadows where there was only light, to kiss my forehead and tell me not to worry. Instead, he went perfectly still. He did not explode into sudden anger. There was no shouting, no dramatic pacing across the hardwood floor, but when he pulled back to look at me, the expression in his dark eyes was one of profound, quiet devastation. "A prenuptial agreement?" Theo asked, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with a vulnerability that broke my heart. "She thinks we are after your house. She thinks my family wants your money. She is just a judge, Theo." I rushed to explain, suddenly feeling an intense surge of guilt, my own hands trembling slightly as I reached for his. "She sees the worst-case scenarios every single day. It is an occupational hazard. I told her it was absurd. I told her how wonderful you and your parents are." Theo looked away, his jaw tightening as he stared blankly at the television screen. "My family does not live like that, Josephine. We do not operate by measuring every cent and drawing hard boundaries between people we love. When you are family, you are family. We share. We support each other. If I had nothing tomorrow, my parents would give me their last dollar without asking for a receipt or drawing up a contract. That is what love is to us." Every word he spoke felt like a tiny, precise needle pricking my conscience. I felt like a traitor. I looked at the man I loved, a man who offered me nothing but warmth, emotional security, and complete inclusion, and I felt utterly ashamed that I had even entertained my aunt's cold logic. Theo represented a mature, safe, and trusting love. By bringing the gray folder into our home and giving voice to Naomi's suspicions, I felt I had violated that sacred trust. "I am so sorry," I whispered, resting my head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. I know you are not like that. I am not going to let her cynicism infect us. We are better than that." Theo wrapped his arm around me and squeezed my shoulder, offering a sad, forgiving smile that only made me feel infinitely worse. The seasoned crisis manager in me had completely failed to navigate the emotional landscape of my own living room. I had allowed myself to become the villain in my own love story, the paranoid, calculating woman who doubted her husband before they had even walked down the aisle. Later that night, long after Theo had fallen asleep in the bedroom, I sat alone at my kitchen island. The city of Boston was quiet outside my window, the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty pavement. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. In front of me, resting on the cold granite countertop, was Aunt Naomi's gray folder. I traced the edges of the thick cardboard with my index finger. I hated it. I hated what it represented. I was entirely convinced that it was a useless, insulting precaution, an artifact of an old woman's bitter, jaded worldview. I did not know it then, as the clock ticked past midnight, but that gray folder was not merely a shield intended for a hypothetical future. It was the key that would soon unlock the true terrifying face of an entire family. Sunday arrived with the crisp, unforgiving chill of a Boston autumn. I stood before the Hargroves' imposing townhouse in the Back Bay neighborhood, gripping the cold iron railing of the front steps. The neighborhood itself was a fortress of old money, characterized by gas lamps, perfectly swept brick sidewalks, and heavy oak doors that kept the world securely outside. I took a deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my tailored dress, determined to banish the lingering shadows of Aunt Naomi's warnings from my mind. I was here to have a pleasant meal with my future family. Vivian opened the door before I could even ring the bell. "Josephine, my darling girl," she cooed, enveloping me in an embrace that smelled of expensive, understated floral perfume and roasted lamb. "We have been counting the minutes." She ushered me inside, guiding me through a hallway lined with tasteful, muted oil paintings. The dining room was a masterpiece of domestic theater. Starched ivory tablecloths draped flawlessly over a long mahogany table. Heavy, antique silver cutlery gleamed under the soft light of a crystal chandelier. Every water goblet was aligned with mathematical precision. The wine was poured with a practiced, seamless grace by Vivian herself. Every single detail in the room was fiercely curated to project an image of absolute, unshakable stability. It was an environment designed to make you feel privileged simply to be allowed a seat at the table. During the first course, I made a point to observe the family dynamic closely, my professional instincts kicking in despite my desire to relax. Walter Hargrove, Theo's father, sat at the head of the table. He ate his endive salad with the mechanical, quiet precision of a man who had surrendered his voice decades ago. He nodded when spoken to, offered polite, monosyllabic agreements, and seemed entirely content to fade into the expensive wallpaper. He was the patriarch in name only. Opposite him sat Reed, Theo's younger brother. If Walter was invisible, Reed was a siren. He was a man composed entirely of sharp cologne and loud, hollow confidence. Throughout the main course, he dominated the conversation, gesturing wildly with his fork as he spoke of his latest entrepreneurial ventures. He talked endlessly about synergizing capital, disrupting regional markets, and aggressive growth strategies. Yet, for all his boasting, I realized with a sudden clarity that he never once managed to articulate what his actual business did. He spoke in aggressive circles, dropping corporate buzzwords that hung in the air like cheap smoke. He sounded exactly like the desperate executives I managed during corporate implosions, men who used big words to hide massive deficits. After the heavy silver plates were cleared, Vivian brought out a delicate pear tart. As she sliced the dessert, the atmosphere in the room underwent a subtle yet profound shift. The bright, performative cheerfulness evaporated. Vivian placed her silver dessert server down and leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the table. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, effectively inviting me into the sacred, exclusive vault of Hargrove family secrets. "Josephine, sweetheart," Vivian began, her eyes welling with a perfectly calibrated amount of manufactured maternal distress. "We are so thrilled to have you joining our family. You bring such a grounding energy to Theo. That is why I feel I can be entirely transparent with you. Family must have no secrets." I nodded, maintaining a polite smile, though a faint alarm bell began to ring in the back of my mind. Vivian reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over mine. Poor Reed is dealing with a temporary cash flow hiccup. A terrible misunderstanding with a primary partner has temporarily frozen his operating accounts. It is nothing, really, just a brief, unfortunate storm. But the timing is dreadful with the quarter ending. She paused, letting the weight of her maternal worry settle over the table. I waited, my pulse quickening slightly beneath her warm hand. She was not asking for emotional support. The buildup was too calculated. He needs a bridge to get through the next 6 weeks, Vivian continued, her voice smoother than silk. We were hoping you might be able to extend a small courtesy loan to the business, $45,000. Or, honestly, it might be easier and cleaner if you simply allowed us to use your Brookline property to secure a short-term commercial note, just for 6 weeks. Darling, the bank just needs to see a clean, unencumbered asset on paper to release the funds. It is a mere formality. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had not asked for a few $100s to cover a misstep. She had asked for a massive sum of liquid cash, or more terrifyingly, she wanted to leverage the only piece of real security I owned, the house my grandmother had left me, and she had asked for it over dessert, as casually as asking me to pass the sugar. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of the request, Theo chimed in. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, leaning in close. It is just what families do, Joe. We help each other out when things get tight. Once we are married, bridging gaps like this will just be second nature for us. We are building a life together, and Reed is part of that life. He would do the exact same thing for us if the roles were reversed. The heavy mahogany table suddenly felt exactly like Aunt Naomi's courtroom bench. Her cold, sharp voice echoed in my head, slicing through the fog of Theo's romanticized guilt trip. If they are genuine, paperwork will not scare them. If they get angry over paperwork, it is no longer family affection. It is an agenda. I slowly pulled my hand back from beneath Vivian's grasp. I reached for my crystal water goblet, taking a slow, deliberate sip to buy myself a fraction of a second to lock away my shock. I placed the glass down precisely on its coaster. When I looked up, I summoned my best crisis management persona. I smiled, a polite, professional, and entirely impenetrable expression. I completely understand how stressful corporate cash flow issues can be. Vivian, I said, keeping my tone beautifully even and light, devoid of any accusation. These things happen in business all the time. I am happy to take a look and see if I can consider the request. Just have Reed send over the standard documentation to my email tomorrow morning. I kept my eyes locked on Vivian's face as I listed my terms. I will need to see the current debt schedules, the original partnership contracts, the status of any existing collateral he might have, his current cash flow statements for the last 3 quarters, and a detailed, itemized breakdown of the intended use of the funds. Once I have the full paperwork, I can review it properly and give you a firm answer. The silence that crashed down over the dining room was absolute, suffocating, and heavy. Vivian's smile did not physically leave her face. Her lips remained curved upward in that perfect, gracious arch she had worn all afternoon. But her eyes changed completely. The maternal warmth vanished in a microsecond, replaced by a cold, calculating, and vicious flash that lasted only a single heartbeat before she blinked it away. The mask had slipped, just for a moment, revealing the predator beneath the perfect hostess. Reed did not bother to hide his reaction. He slammed his silver dessert fork down onto his plate with a sharp clatter, glaring at me as if I had just stood up and insulted his mother to her face. His neck flushed a deep, angry red. "You have got to be kidding me," Reed scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms defensively. "Are you serious right now?" The drive home that evening was a nightmare of unspoken hostility. The interior of Theo's car felt incredibly small, the air thick with tension. The silence stretched for several blocks as we navigated the darkening streets of Boston. Finally, Theo gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white, and he snapped, "I cannot believe you just did that," he said. his voice hard and entirely devoid of the warmth I loved. You turned a simple family Sunday dinner into a hostile bank audit. My mother asked for a favor. Josephine. She opened her home to you. She treated you like a daughter, and you treated her like a suspected criminal applying for a subprime loan. I turned my head to look out the passenger window at the passing city lights, watching the glowing storefronts blur together. I did not feel like a paranoid villain anymore. I felt entirely awake. For the first time since he had placed the ring on my finger, I felt a deep, structural crack forming between us. It was a fissure that had nothing to do with wedding venues or floral arrangements. It was no longer a disagreement fueled by my aunt's legal cynicism or a temporary clash of emotions. It was a fundamental collision of our core principles. I realized, sitting in the cold leather seat of his car, that my future husband believed familial love required blind, unquestioning financial submission. I, on the other hand, believed that the truth should never be afraid of a paper trail, and in that silent car, I knew Aunt Naomi had been entirely right. The days following that Sunday afternoon stretched into a prolonged, suffocating silence. Theo did not yell. He did not pack a bag and storm out of my apartment. Instead, he deployed a weapon far more effective against someone who spent her life managing loud, chaotic crises total, freezing withdrawal. He would come home from his architectural firm, offer a brief, monotone greeting, and retreat into his home office. When I tried to initiate conversation, his replies were clipped, carefully devoid of any warmth or affection. He slept on the far edge of our bed, leaving a vast, cold expanse of white sheets between us. It was a calculated punishment designed to make me feel entirely responsible for the rupture, and terrifyingly, it began to work. By the fourth day of this icy treatment, the confident professional who demanded financial transparency felt replaced by a desperate, anxious woman entirely willing to doubt her own instincts. I caught myself wondering if I had overreacted, if my professional cynicism had truly poisoned a simple act of familial solidarity. That creeping self-doubt might have consumed me entirely had it not been for the careless arrogance of my prospective brother-in-law. Late on a Thursday evening, while Theo was sequestered in another room, I found myself aimlessly scrolling through social media. There, glaringly bright against the dark screen of my phone, was Reed's latest post. He was standing on the meticulously manicured green of an exclusive country club, gripping a titanium driver, a wide, carefree grin plastered across his face. The caption boasted about finishing 18 holes before noon. A quick swipe revealed a second photo from the previous night, a sprawling table at a high-end steakhouse in the Seaport district, laden with thick cuts of meat and 3 bottles of wine that I recognized from corporate dinners. Bottles that easily cost $500 apiece. He had tagged the location and added a celebratory hashtag about closing big deals. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. This was the exact same week his family claimed his operating accounts were entirely frozen. The same week they begged me to put a lien on my inheritance to save him from financial ruin. The math simply did not align. The next morning, as Theo stood by the kitchen counter pouring his coffee, I carefully breached the subject. I did not mention the photographs. I simply asked, in the most neutral tone I could muster, what exactly Reed's company produced or managed that required such a massive, sudden influx of capital? Theo did not look at me. He kept his gaze fixed on the dark liquid filling his mug. It is a specialized procurement firm, Josephine. They deal with supply chain logistics and bridging vendor gaps. It is highly complicated. The market shifted unexpectedly last quarter. His voice was stiff, heavily rehearsed. I pressed gently, asking why a standard business loan was impossible if the corporate contracts were solid. Theo finally looked up, his jaw set in a hard, defensive line. My mother is handling the logistics of it. She understands the nuance of his situation better than anyone. You do not need to interrogate me about the minutiae of my brother's livelihood. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out the door, leaving the scent of his coffee hanging in the quiet kitchen. My mother is handling it. The phrase echoed in my mind, raising the hairs on the back of my neck. My phone vibrated on my desk at Astor Point Advisory precisely at noon. It was Aunt Naomi. She did not bother with a polite greeting. "I had a clerk pull the public property records for the Back Bay residence," she announced, her voice crackling with sharp, undeniable authority over the cellular connection. "The picture they are painting is a complete fabrication." I closed my office door, leaning heavily against the solid wood. Naomi continued, laying out the facts with surgical precision. "The townhouse is not fully owned. It currently carries two distinct mortgages. The first is a substantial primary loan taken out 7 years ago. The second is a home equity line of credit drawn to its absolute maximum limit just 14 months ago. They are leveraged to the hilt. Josephine, this is not a family sitting on comfortable wealth experiencing a minor cash flow issue with one son. This is a family using their primary residence as a constant, desperate cash machine." The ground beneath my feet felt as though it were made of ash. Naomi's revelation prompted me to make a discreet inquiry of my own. I reached out to a former client, a senior underwriter at a boutique private equity firm. I asked him, strictly off the record, if he had ever encountered the Hargrove name in his professional circles. He called me back 2 hours later. "I cannot send you the physical files, Josephine, but I can tell you this," he said, his tone hushed and serious. "Vivian Hargrove is a known entity in the secondary lending market. Over the past 5 years, her name has been attached to at least 3 high-risk bridge loans. We are talking exorbitant interest rates, the kind of money people borrow when traditional banks lock the doors on them. The strange part is, they always manage to pay them off right before the default wire trips, usually with a sudden, unexplained injection of capital from an outside source." The puzzle pieces snapped into place with sickening clarity. I was not being welcomed into a loving family. I was being recruited. I was being evaluated not as a future daughter-in-law, but as a pristine, unburdened asset structure. I had 0 debt, a flawless credit history, and a piece of prime real estate free and clear of any liens. I was the perfect, easily exploitable financial vehicle to absorb their next wave of debt. The final confirmation of their true intentions arrived that weekend. Theo, having seemingly thawed his icy demeanor, took me out for a quiet dinner. He held my hand across the table, his thumb stroking my knuckles in a gesture that felt more like a calming tactic than genuine affection. "I was thinking," he began, his voice soft and highly persuasive. "The wedding planning is becoming so overwhelming for both of us. What if we just went down to the courthouse and handled the legal registration next Friday? We can still have the big ceremony and the reception in 4 months, exactly as planned. But doing the legal paperwork now would make things so much easier for insurance purposes, tax filings, and getting you onto my health care plan." The sheer audacity of the suggestion made my stomach churn. I remembered Naomi's stark warning. This was not a sudden burst of impatient romance. It was an accelerated timeline to legally bind my name, and by extension, my financial assets, to their fracturing economic picture before I could ask too many more questions. They needed the marriage certificate to legitimize the collateral transfer they had planned for my house. I told him I needed time to think about it, citing a deep-seated superstition about splitting the anniversary dates. He smiled, but his eyes remained flat and disappointed. Later that evening, I walked out of the master bathroom and paused in the darkened hallway. The door to Theo's study was slightly ajar. I could hear his voice murmuring into his phone. I held my breath, stepping closer to the thin crack of warm light spilling onto the floorboards. He was not speaking with the confident, measured tone of a successful architect. His voice was pitched higher, tight with anxiety, almost whining. I tried. "Mother," he said, his tone shockingly submissive, sounding exactly like a little boy reporting a failure to a highly demanding parent. "I brought up the courthouse idea just like you said. She is hesitating. She wants to wait for the ceremony. I cannot push her too hard right now. She is already highly suspicious after Sunday." I stood completely frozen in the hallway, the chill of the hardwood floor seeping into my bare feet. He was not a partner building an equal life with me. He was an operative reporting back to base. As I listened to him placate the woman on the other end of the line, apologizing profusely for his inability to secure my immediate compliance, the final illusion shattered. I saw the absolute, undeniable truth. The man I was preparing to marry had never truly grown out of Vivian's shadow. His entire existence, his career, his relationship with me, it was all entirely subservient to the crushing, manipulative power of his mother. The suspicion that had taken root in my mind could no longer be contained by simple observation. I needed documented history. I needed to know if the trap closing around me had ever caught anyone else. The next morning, I bypassed my usual routine and called Celia Vaughn. Celia and I had navigated the grueling trenches of our undergraduate years together, but while I chose public relations, she went into civil litigation. She possessed a brilliant, ruthless legal mind and had access to every court docket in the state of Massachusetts. I asked her to run a comprehensive background check on Vivian Hargrove, specifically looking for dismissed civil claims or sealed financial disputes. I told her to go back at least 10 years. Celia called me back 2 days later. Her tone was completely stripped of its usual sarcastic warmth. "I found something. Josephine," Celia said, the sound of keyboard keys clacking in the background. "It is a civil suit filed 4 years ago. It never went to trial. The judge dismissed it with prejudice during the discovery phase, but the allegations are remarkably specific. The plaintiff accused Vivian of defrauding her of a substantial temporary support loan." I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the back of my neck. "Who was the plaintiff?" "A woman named Marlene Pike," Celia replied. "She used to own a rather prominent contemporary art gallery on Newbury Street. After the suit was dismissed, the gallery went under. She liquidated everything and moved out of state. I managed to trace a current phone number to a real estate office in Miami." I thanked Celia, my hands trembling slightly as I wrote down the 10 digits. I waited until I was entirely alone in my office, the door locked and the blinds drawn, before I dialed the number. When Marlene Pike answered, her voice carried the exhausted, raspy weight of someone who had spent years trying to forget a severe trauma. I introduced myself carefully, explaining only that I was engaged to Theo Hargrove and that I had recently been approached by his mother for a short-term financial favor. The silence on the other end of the line was so absolute I thought the call had dropped. Then, Marlene let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Get out," Marlene said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "Pack your things, change your locks, and get out right now." "Marlene, please," I urged, gripping the phone tightly. "I need to know what she did to you. I need to know how it started." Marlene sighed, a sound of profound defeat. "It starts with her making you feel like you are the center of her universe. She is warm, she is gracious, she acts like you are the missing piece of her family puzzle. She invited me to dinners, charity galas, private viewings. She integrated herself into my life so seamlessly I did not even notice the boundaries dissolving." I closed my eyes, visualizing the exact same maternal embrace Vivian had given me just weeks ago. "Then comes the crisis," Marlene continued, the anger slowly bleeding back into her tone. "It is never a demand. It is a tragedy, a sudden, unavoidable emergency that threatens the family honor. For me, she claimed Walter's pension fund had been temporarily frozen due to an administrative error and they were going to lose a prime investment property. She asked for $85,000. She swore on her life it was only for 3 weeks. My breath hitched. The script was practically identical. Only the designated victim and the fabricated emergency had changed. "Why did you give it to her without a contract?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Because of the men," Marlene replied instantly. "That is her true genius, Josephine. Vivian does not just use her own charm. She uses the men in her family as a moral backdrop to validate her lies. You look at Walter, so quiet and respectable, and you think he could never be party to a scam. You look at Theo, building a brilliant career, and you think they must be legitimate. She uses their reputations as a stamp of credibility. You are manipulated into believing that asking for legal paperwork would be a grave insult to these fine, upstanding men. The truth of her words hit me with staggering force. It was the exact emotional leverage Theo had used in the car. He had made me feel guilty for demanding a paper trail, framing it as an attack on his family's honor. "I never saw a single penny returned," Marlene said, her voice hollow. When the 3 weeks passed, the excuses started, then the gaslighting. She claimed the money was an investment in a joint venture we had discussed verbally, not alone. When I threatened to sue, she completely cut me off. I took her to court, but I had nothing. I had a few vague text messages thanking me for my support and my own emotional testimony. She had high-priced lawyers who tore me apart on the stand, painting me as an unstable woman trying to extort a respected Boston family. The judge threw it out. I lost the gallery. I lost my reputation. She kept the money. I thanked Marlene, promising to keep her confidence, and ended the call. I sat in my quiet office as the Boston skyline darkened outside my window. The gray folder Aunt Naomi had given me suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Her advice was never about doubting the concept of love. It was a tactical maneuver. Naomi understood that emotional predators thrive in the gray areas of trust and verbal promises. The only way to expose them was to force their hidden agendas into the glaring light of documented evidence. That evening, I decided to test the depth of the infection. When Theo came home, I waited until we were sitting in the living room. The television was off. The apartment was entirely still. "Theo," I began carefully, maintaining a neutral expression. "I was having lunch with a colleague today, and someone mentioned a woman who used to run a gallery here in town, Marlene Pike. Do you remember her?" Theo had been in the middle of unbuttoning his cuffs. His hands stopped moving instantly. He did not look up right away. When he finally raised his eyes to meet mine, there was no curiosity in them. There was only a sudden, violent flare of defensive rage. "Why are you bringing up that woman?" he snapped, his voice hard and sharp. "I just asked if you knew her," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly calm. "I heard she had some sort of falling out with your mother a few years ago." Theo stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Are you investigating my family? Josephine? Are you digging through old, dismissed garbage to find reasons to smear my mother?" Marlene Pike was an unstable, vindictive woman who tried to ruin my family because a business deal went sour. My mother was the victim in that situation. He was reciting a script. The cadence of his words was too perfect, too rehearsed. He did not ask what Marlene had said. He immediately launched into a prepackaged character assassination to protect Vivian. Looking at him, a man I had planned to spend the rest of my life with, I felt a physical ache in my chest that had nothing to do with Vivian Hargrove. The true tragedy was not that my future mother-in-law was a financial predator. The tragedy was that Theo was utterly, hopelessly, bound to her system. His blind, furious protection of her actions hurt far more than any lie Vivian could tell. I realized I was not merely facing off against a greedy woman. I was standing against a deeply entrenched, pathological loyalty that would always, inevitably, choose Vivian over me. Theo stormed into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, and leaving me alone in the living room. I did not follow him. I did not try to apologize or soothe his engineered outrage. I felt entirely cold, stripped of the romantic illusions that had clouded my judgment for the past year. I opened my laptop and created a new, secure folder on my desktop. I made the first truly ruthless decision of our relationship. From this exact moment forward, I would not engage in a single verbal conversation regarding the wedding budget, my personal assets, or the requested financial assistance. I would not allow Vivian to operate in the shadows of emotional manipulation. Every demand, every promise, every excuse from the Hargrove family would have to be typed, sent, and digitally recorded. The battle was no longer about saving my relationship. It was about building an impenetrable fortress of evidence. The battlefield shifted from the awkward, suffocating confines of the Hargrove dining room to the cold, undeniable realm of electronic correspondence. I knew that spoken words could be twisted, denied, or reinterpreted through the lens of emotional manipulation. So, I sat at my kitchen island, the harsh glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark apartment, and prepared to force their hand. I drafted an email addressed directly to Vivian, deliberately copying Theo on the thread. I kept the tone impeccably polite, stripping away any trace of anger or accusation. It read exactly like the professional correspondence of the crisis management director I was. I stated that I was certainly willing to review the family request for financial support, but my fiduciary duty to my own estate required standard due diligence. I laid out my conditions with absolute clarity. I stated I would only consider moving forward if they provided a formally secured promissory note, a comprehensive and certified schedule of all current debts, undeniable proof of the intended use of the funds, an independent appraisal of any collateral properties, and a mandatory signing session with my personal attorney present in the room. I read the draft twice, hit send, and waited for the explosion. I truly expected a long period of silence, or perhaps a phone call filled with theatrical tears and delays, while they scrambled to invent new excuses. Instead, the reply arrived in my inbox barely 4 hours later. It was shockingly fast for a family that was supposedly drowning in a chaotic, tangled mess of unexpectedly frozen accounts. The email contained very little text, just a brief, sickly sweet note from Vivian thanking me for my pragmatism, accompanied by a massive, perfectly collated PDF file. Opening the attachment, I was genuinely taken aback. It looked polished, wrapped in a thick veneer of corporate professionalism. There were colorful pie charts illustrating cash flow, crisp company letterheads, and pages of dense, highly technical financial jargon. To an untrained eye, it looked like a perfectly solid, albeit complex, investment portfolio, but I did not have an untrained eye. And more importantly, I had Judge Naomi Mercer in my corner. I printed the entire 60-page document, placed it in a secure binder, and took a cab straight to Beacon Hill. Naomi did not offer me tea. She simply took the binder, spread the pages across her vast mahogany desk, and put on her reading glasses. The silence in the room stretched for 20 minutes as her sharp eyes darted back and forth across the paper, her pen hovering like a hawk over prey. Then, she let out a short, humorless sound. She uncapped a red pen and began circling sections. "Look at this parcel code on the property assessment page," Naomi instructed, tapping the thick paper with authority. "It is formatted with exactly 7 digits. Suffolk County uses a 9-digit alphanumeric system for all residential and commercial zones. It has been that way for over a decade. Now look at this bank verification stamp on page 12. The ink density is perfectly uniform across the entire seal, but the date alignment is off by a microscopic fraction of a millimeter. It is a digital overlay, copied and pasted from another document. Furthermore, the transaction dates they provided for the supposed frozen vendor accounts fall on a Sunday and a federal banking holiday. Certified banks do not process commercial wire transfers on those days." The documents were not just misleading, they were actively, meticulously fabricated. To be absolutely certain that we were not misinterpreting administrative incompetence as malice, I sent the digital file to a forensic specialist Celia had recommended. He did not need long to rip the file apart. He called me later that same afternoon, his voice laced with professional amusement. Whoever made this file was trying very hard to look like a Wall Street analyst, but they completely forgot to scrub the background metadata. The expert explained calmly over the phone. This file was not generated by a certified bank or an accounting firm. It was compiled, edited, and exported to a portable document format from a private laptop. The author tag reads Reed Hargrove, and the timestamp shows it was finalized at exactly 11:45 at night, just one single day before they brought the emergency up to you at Sunday dinner. The isolated pieces of data violently slammed together in my mind, forming a horrifying, cohesive picture. The entire story about Reed's business partner freezing accounts was a complete, calculated fiction. There was no temporary cash flow problem for a logistics company. The reality was far more desperate and far more dangerous. Vivian had leveraged her entire life into a corner, buried under high-interest secondary debt and maxed-out credit lines. She urgently needed a pristine, unencumbered asset exactly like my Brookline house to secure a massive refinancing package. She was trying to buy time, creating a makeshift financial bridge to keep her aggressive creditors at bay until our wedding day. Once we were legally married, she fully intended to use the legal entanglement and familial guilt to force me into absorbing her financial disaster. I was not a beloved future daughter to her. I was a lifeboat constructed of clean credit and equity. I did not let my rising disgust dictate my next move. I replied to Vivian's email, keeping my words perfectly measured and infuriatingly polite. I thanked her for the prompt response and the detailed portfolio, but noted, quite innocently, that my attorney had flagged a few clerical inconsistencies regarding the county parcel codes and the holiday transaction dates. I asked if perhaps she had sent a preliminary working draft by mistake and requested the official, bank-issued hard copies sent directly from the institution. Vivian did not retreat, and she certainly did not attempt to fix the errors. Faced with an intellectual wall, she could not charm her way through. She abandoned the loving mother persona entirely. Her response was a masterclass in aggressive gaslighting and deflection. She did not address a single clerical error or acknowledge the fake stamps. Instead, she launched a blistering personal attack. She accused me of being a paranoid control freak, entirely obsessed with wealth and legal technicalities, and completely ignorant of the foundational trust that true families required to survive. She wrote that it broke her heart to see Theo tied to a woman with such a transactional, suspicious soul, implying that my actions were tearing her son apart. Theo had been copied on the entire exchange. I waited for him to see the truth, hoping the blatant manipulation would finally break his conditioning. When he finally walked into our apartment that evening, his face was a tight mask of furious indignation. But his anger was not directed at the forged documents, the fake parcel numbers, or his mother's vicious insults toward me. His rage was directed entirely at my defiance. He slammed his briefcase onto the hardwood floor. "You are treating my mother like a hostile witness in a federal fraud trial," Theo shouted, his voice echoing off the walls, heavy with disbelief. "She practically begs you for help. She swallows her pride and sends you everything you ask for, and you have your lawyers tear it apart looking for typos just to humiliate her. You are interrogating her. Josephine, you are weaponizing your lawyers against my family." I stared at him, utterly stunned by the depth of his blindness. He had read the exact same emails I had, yet he categorically refused to see the glaring lies. He chose instead to interpret my basic boundaries as a cruel prosecution of a helpless, loving woman. He saw the evidence of forgery and labeled it a typo, as if the evening had not been revealing enough. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. I picked it up, squinting at the bright screen in the dark bedroom. It was a text message from Reed. He was clearly intoxicated, his grammar sloppy, his arrogant facade crumbling into panicked anger. He complained bitterly about my stalling tactics. "You think you are so incredibly smart," the message read, the words blurring together. "If you keep playing your lawyer games with the paperwork, everything is going to collapse before the signing date, and it will be entirely your fault when we lose it all." I sat up in bed, the cold glow of the screen illuminating my face. There it was, handed to me on a silver platter of drunken frustration. A deadline. They were not just generally in debt. They were facing an imminent financial cliff. There was a specific, fast-approaching date when their loans would definitively default, and they were racing the clock, desperate to secure my asset before that countdown reached zero. The next morning, I sat quietly in Naomi's office and showed her the printed email thread and a screenshot of the late-night text message. The judge leaned back in her heavy leather chair, steepling her fingers together over her desk. A grim, profoundly satisfied smile touched the corners of her mouth. "Good," Naomi said softly, her eyes glinting with the sharp, unforgiving light of a seasoned prosecutor closing a trap. Now their intentions are no longer simply floating in the air as vague promises and emotional manipulation. They have begun to leave fingerprints. The Vanguard room at the Four Seasons was booked for what was supposed to be a private menu tasting for the upcoming reception. When Theo and I arrived at 6 o'clock that Saturday evening, I expected to see the chef, a sommelier, and perhaps Vivian and Walter. Instead, the heavy oak double doors opened to reveal a private cocktail reception in full swing. At least 30 people milled about the opulent space, holding crystal flutes of vintage champagne. I recognized Vivian's country club acquaintances, a few wealthy aunts and uncles from Theo's extended family, and several men Reed had previously introduced as his strategic partners. Vivian had not just invited guests, she had assembled an audience. She had constructed a social arena designed specifically to corner me. The trap was brilliant in its sheer, suffocating elegance. By transforming a private wedding errand into a public social event, Vivian intended to use the crushing weight of Boston high society etiquette against me. She glided through the room in a sapphire silk dress, kissing cheeks and orchestrating the evening with the ruthless precision of a stage director. Theo immediately vanished into the crowd to greet his cousins, leaving me standing near a towering display of white orchids, nursing a glass of sparkling water and watching the performance unfold. Just before the servers began bringing out the first course of seared scallops, Vivian stepped to the center of the room. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it gently against the rim of her champagne flute. The delicate ringing sound instantly silenced the room. All eyes turned toward the matriarch. "Family and friends," Vivian began, her voice radiating a warmth that I now knew was entirely manufactured. "We are gathered here tonight to taste the menu for what will undoubtedly be the wedding of the season. But more importantly, we are here to celebrate the extraordinary woman standing over there." She gestured toward me, her smile blindingly bright. The crowd turned, their faces beaming with polite, expectant approval. "We all know that true family is not just about sharing a name," Vivian continued, her voice swelling with theatrical emotion. "It is about standing together when the winds blow hard. It is about unwavering, generous support. And Josephine has recently proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that she possesses a spirit of profound generosity. She has shown us that she truly deserves to step into the Hargrove family. To Josephine, a remarkable future daughter, and a true savior in times of need." She raised her glass high. The entire room erupted into applause. They raised their glasses, nodding at me with knowing, admiring smiles. I stood frozen, the blood rushing in my ears. The sheer tactical genius of her toast was paralyzing. She had not mentioned a specific dollar amount or a property deed. She had painted a masterpiece of implication. In front of her most influential peers, she had publicly anointed me as the family benefactor. I realized instantly what she was doing. If I simply smiled, nodded, and accepted the applause, her fabricated narrative would instantly solidify into an undeniable social truth. In the world Vivian inhabited, social truth was a weapon far deadlier than any legally binding contract. If I accepted the toast and later refused to sign over my house, I would not be a cautious woman protecting her assets. I would be a cruel, deceitful liar who publicly promised to save her future family and then backed out, leaving them to ruin. I would be the villain. The applause began to fade, replaced by a suffocating, expectant silence. They were waiting for my gracious acceptance. I did not flush with anger. I felt an absolute, freezing calm wash over me. I stepped forward, away from the orchids, moving into the center of the room. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a tone that was soft, pleasant, and highly conversational, but perfectly pitched to carry to the very back of the room. "Thank you, Vivian, for such a passionate toast," I said, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "It is a monumental step, joining a new family. But since we are celebrating transparency and support tonight, I think it is only fair that everyone understands the exact nature of the generosity you are praising." The smiles in the room began to falter. A cold, uncomfortable tension swept across the elegant space. "Just so we are all on the exact same page before we sit down to eat," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "You are confirming, right here and now, that the financial backing you requested from my personal estate is not a small, temporary operational bridge for Reed's logistics company, as originally stated. You are confirming that you need my property to secure a massive refinancing package to handle the multiple delinquent, high-interest secondary mortgages currently threatening your primary residence. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a physical vacuum. The air was sucked entirely out of the room. A woman near the front dropped her fork onto a porcelain plate with a sharp, echoing clatter. No one breathed. Vivian's face lost all its color, turning a stark, ashen white. For a fraction of a second, absolute panic fractured her perfect composure. But she was a survivor of high society warfare. She instantly pivoted, her face contorting into an expression of profound, wounded agony. "How dare you?" Vivian gasped, pressing a hand to her chest, her voice trembling with the perfect pitch of a victim. "How dare you bring such ugly, clinical lies into a celebration of love? I open my heart to you. I invite you into my sacred inner circle, and you attempt to humiliate me. You reduce the beautiful concept of family to cold, calculating accounting. You care more about money than human beings." Before I could utter another word, Theo materialized beside me, his hand clamped around my upper arm like a vice. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he practically dragged me out of the Vanguard room, through the heavy oak doors, and into the deserted, dimly lit hallway of the Four Seasons. He spun me around to face him, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a frantic, unhinged rage. "What is wrong with you?" Theo hissed, his voice echoing sharply off the marble walls. "Are you completely insane? You just deliberately humiliated my mother in front of our entire social circle. You humiliated me. You turned a celebration into a sick, twisted power struggle just to prove you are the smartest person in the room." "I forced her to tell the truth," I shot back, wrenching my arm out of his grasp. "She tried to trap me with an audience, Theo. She tried to use your friends to guilt me into handing over my grandmother's house to pay off her loan sharks." "It is a temporary setback," Theo yelled, completely abandoning his quiet, refined demeanor. "It is family business, and you just aired it out for the entire world to judge. You do not care about us. You only care about winning." "Vivian, enough." The voice was low, gravelly, and entirely unexpected. Theo and I both whipped around. Walter Hargrove was standing in the doorway, the patriarch. The man who had barely uttered a complete sentence since the day I met him stepped into the hallway. He did not look at me. He looked directly at the space just behind Theo, where Vivian had silently appeared, her face still twisted in dramatic distress. "Walter, do not tell me enough," Vivian cried out, playing her final card. "Look at what she is doing to us." "I said, enough," Walter repeated. The absolute, bone-weary exhaustion in his voice was devastating. It was not a command born of anger, but of a man who had spent decades watching a slow-motion car crash and could no longer pretend he did not see the wreckage. He looked at his wife, and for the first time, I saw the crushing weight of their true financial reality pressing down on his shoulders. Those 3 simple words told me everything I needed to know. Walter knew exactly how deep the debt was. He knew about the forged documents. He had known about the trap all along, and his silence had been his complicity. Suddenly, the heavy doors burst open again. Reed stormed out, his face flushed, reeking of expensive scotch and unchecked entitlement. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You stuck-up, ungrateful bitch!" Reed snarled, abandoning any pretense of brotherly affection. "You think you are so special. You think you are better than us. You are nothing but a walking bank account. You only matter because your dead grandmother left you a piece of real estate in a zip code you could never afford on your own. You should be honored we even let you sit at our table." Theo did not punch his brother. He did not defend me. He simply stood there, breathing heavily, looking between his mother and the floor. The brutal, unvarnished truth hung in the hallway, stripped of all the elegant manners and sweet maternal lies. Reed had just handed me the Rosetta Stone to their entire family dynamic. He had voiced exactly how they had viewed me from the very first day Theo brought me home. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I looked at Theo, the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, sweeping emptiness. "Have a wonderful tasting," I said quietly. I turned my back on the Hargrove family and walked down the long, carpeted hallway toward the elevators. I walked out of the Four Seasons and into the cool, dark Boston night alone. As the city lights blurred past me in the window of my cab, the final illusion broke apart. The wedding was no longer a shared dream of a future together. It never had been. It was simply a corporate merger, a calculated financial instrument they had designed to forcefully insert my name into their crumbling, desperate system of debt, and I was finally free of it. I gave myself exactly 24 hours to process the wreckage of the tasting dinner before I sent the formal notice. I did not call Theo to discuss it. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee and drafted a brief, emotionally detached email addressed to him, the wedding planner, and both sets of parents. I stated clearly that the ceremony was postponed indefinitely. Deep down, I was still holding on to a microscopic sliver of hope that hitting the brakes so violently would shock Theo into waking up. I thought the prospect of losing the wedding would finally force him to look at the glaring red flags surrounding his mother and choose the woman he claimed to love over the system he was born into. I was entirely wrong. Theo called me within 5 minutes of the email hitting his inbox. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not want to discuss his brother's aggressive, drunken confession in the hotel hallway. His voice was tight, vibrating with an exhausted sort of annoyance, like a manager dealing with an unruly employee. "You are overreacting. Josephine," he sighed heavily into the receiver. "Cancel the emails right now. All you need to do is go over to my parents' house today. Sit down and apologize to my mother for the terrible scene you caused at the hotel. If you do that, we can get everything back on track." Back on track. He spoke as if I had merely worn the wrong color to a dinner party, not exposed a massive, desperate financial conspiracy. I hung up the phone without saying a word. Vivian, however, did not wait around for an apology. She immediately went on the offensive, launching a scorched earth smear campaign with terrifying speed and efficiency. Within 3 days, rumors began filtering back to me through mutual acquaintances in the city. Vivian was holding court at her exclusive country club luncheons, painting herself as the heartbroken, benevolent matriarch who had been deceived. She told everyone who would listen that I was an elitist snob who looked down on hardworking people. She claimed I was entirely too pragmatic, devoid of human warmth, and thoroughly poisoned by the legal paranoia of my aunt, the judge. She spun a brilliant narrative where I was the manipulative, controlling force, trying to tear a loyal son away from his loving family over petty financial details. Then, the personal warfare bled directly into my professional life. On a Tuesday morning, the senior managing partner at Astor Point Advisory called me into his glass-walled corner office. He looked deeply uncomfortable, refusing to meet my eyes directly. He informed me that the firm had received an anonymous, highly detailed phone call late the previous afternoon. The caller had heavily implied that I was currently suffering from severe emotional instability, that I was dragging volatile personal conflicts into the public sphere, and that my judgment was significantly impaired. As a crisis manager, my entire career relied on an unshakable reputation for absolute discretion and emotional control. Vivian was no longer just trying to steal my house. She was actively trying to destroy my professional reputation to punish me for my defiance. That afternoon, Aunt Naomi did not just offer quiet advice in her study. She brought in heavy artillery. She introduced me to Damian Cross, a seasoned civil litigation attorney who specialized in aggressive corporate defense and high-stakes personal disputes. Damian did not sit behind a desk offering sympathetic nods. He paced the floor of his downtown office, his mind working with cold, clinical precision. "This is no longer a messy domestic breakup, Josephine," Damian stated flatly, adjusting his sharp suit jacket. What you are experiencing right now has crossed the threshold into extortion, targeted defamation, and severe financial coercion. We are no longer playing defense. We are treating this as an active, hostile threat against your person and your livelihood. Following Damien's strict instructions, I stopped mourning the relationship and started cataloging. I transformed my paralyzing anxiety into a meticulously organized, impenetrable database. I saved every single text message from Theo and Reed. I forwarded every single email Vivian had ever sent me to a secure server. I downloaded every voicemail, taking screenshots of call logs, and recorded the exact timestamps of every interaction with the Hargrove family. I became a forensic accountant of my own emotional trauma. The most damning piece of evidence, however, did not come from a digital footprint. It arrived in a plain, unmarked manila envelope, delivered by a private courier to my office desk on a Thursday afternoon. There was no return address, but I recognized the heavy, slanted handwriting on the front instantly. It was Walter Hargrove. The silent, beaten patriarch had orchestrated a quiet rebellion. Inside the envelope were photocopies of 3 distinct documents. The first was a final demand letter from a predatory private lending firm, stating the secondary mortgage on their Back Bay townhouse was 90 days in default. The second was a formal notice of intent to foreclose on the property. The third was a statement showing an outstanding balance in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, accruing at an astonishing 26% interest rate. Walter had silently handed me the exact, undeniable proof I needed to confirm that Vivian had lied about every single aspect of their financial peril. It was not a temporary hiccup for a logistics company. It was a catastrophic collapse. The final, shattering blow to my engagement came late that same night. The buzzer to my apartment rang at 11:30. It was Theo. When I opened the door, he looked completely hollowed out. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and he reeked of stale coffee and profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I let him in, but I did not offer him a seat. We stood in the dimly lit foyer. He stared at his shoes for a long time before he finally spoke. "I was trying to fix her phone earlier today," Theo whispered, his voice cracking, sounding like a lost child. The screen froze, and she asked me to reset it. While I was waiting for it to reboot, the messaging application opened automatically. I saw her draft folder. There was a message typed out, addressed to my number, but it was written to look exactly like it came from you. He looked up. His eyes filled with a horrific, dawning realization that he could no longer deny. It said that you had thought it over, that you were transferring the funds to Reed's account tomorrow morning, and that you wanted me to keep it a secret from my parents so you could surprise them with your generosity. Theo continued, his hands shaking. She had it completely ready to send to my phone from a burner number she probably intended to name as yours in my contacts. She was going to fake your consent. The air in my apartment turned to absolute ice. Vivian was not just planning to guilt me into compliance anymore. She was preparing to forge my consent entirely, using her own son as the unwitting recipient of a fabricated electronic trail. She was going to frame me for a financial commitment I never made. In that exact moment, the last lingering ghost of my love for Theo Hargrove evaporated completely. It was not a slow fade. It was a sudden, violent severing. It was replaced by a stark, terrifying clarity. If I softened my boundaries even once, if I let him stay the night, if I answered another phone call or tried to be understanding, my name and my assets would be weaponized to legitimize a massive financial crime. "We are done, Theo," I said. My voice did not shake. There were no tears left to fall. The sadness had been entirely burned away by survival instinct. "The wedding is canceled. The relationship is permanently over. I want you to take your key off your ring, put it on the granite counter, and walk out that door. And I never want you to contact me again." He opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to apologize, or perhaps, tragically, to defend her one last time. But he saw the absolute, impenetrable finality in my eyes, and the words died in his throat. He slowly unhooked the cold metal key, placed it on the kitchen island, and walked out of my life. His shoulders heavy with the weight of the chains he fundamentally refused to break. The next morning, I sat in Damien's office and recounted the late-night visit and the revelation of the drafted text. Damien leaned forward across his desk, his eyes sharp and predatory, like a hound catching a scent. A drafted, forged text message designed to create a false trail of financial consent, Damien summarized, his pen scratching furiously across his yellow legal pad. Combined with the doctored property records, the fake bank stamps we already secured, and the foreclosure notices Walter sent us. She just handed us the missing link. Damien dropped his pen and looked at me with a grim, victorious smile. Vivian Hargrove has officially leaped from toxic family manipulation straight into the realm of actionable, undeniable criminal fraud. Now, we build the trap. The shock of Theo's late-night visit had barely settled into a cold, hardened resolve when my office phone rang the following Tuesday. It was not a number I recognized, and the voice on the other end was clipped, professional, and entirely detached. The caller identified himself as a senior compliance officer for a private lending unit named Bay Ledger Capital. He was calling, he explained with practiced politeness, to conduct a preliminary verification. His firm had recently received a highly credible signal from a secondary broker indicating that I was actively being prepared as the primary guarantor for Vivian Hargrove's upcoming refinancing package. They simply wanted to introduce themselves and confirm my contact details before the final underwriting phase commenced. I sat perfectly still, my hand gripping the receiver so tightly my knuckles turned white. My pristine credit history and the equity of my Brookline home had already been thrown onto the negotiating table. Vivian had not just been planning to pressure me, she was actively trading on my identity in the high-stakes lending market without my knowledge, let alone my signature. I thanked the compliance officer, keeping my voice remarkably level, feigned a minor scheduling conflict to buy time, and promised to have my representation contact him shortly. The moment I ended the call, I immediately contacted Damien. Damien Cross did not express shock when I relayed the conversation. He let out a low, sharp breath that sounded entirely like predatory satisfaction. He understood the strategy instantly. Vivian was bluffing her current lenders to buy herself a few more weeks of breathing room. She was betting everything on the assumption that the suffocating social pressure of the impending wedding, combined with her son's emotional manipulation, would eventually break my resolve. She truly believed that once I was standing at the altar, or perhaps just a few days before the ceremony, I would simply legitimize the done deal to avoid a catastrophic public scandal. She was banking on my supposed desperation to be loved. "We do not send a cease and desist letter," Damien instructed, pacing the length of his office when I arrived an hour later, Aunt Naomi sitting quietly in the corner armchair. If we spook her now, she pulls back, claims it was a rogue broker making an error, and plays the victim once again. We need her to commit. We need her to walk into a room, present her fraudulent narrative as the absolute truth, and sign her name to it under penalty of perjury. Naomi nodded in agreement, her face an unreadable mask of judicial calm. The strategy was set. We were going to build a golden bridge for Vivian Hargrove to cross, only to completely dismantle it the second she reached the middle. We would set up a formal meeting to finalize the financial support according to proper legal procedures. To make the trap work, I had to execute the most grueling performance of my entire life. I had to swallow my disgust, suppress the betrayal radiating through my chest, and play the role of a woman who was slowly, reluctantly, softening. I had to make Vivian believe that her toxic tactics were actually working, that the fear of losing the wedding had finally overridden my financial common sense. I drafted an email to Vivian. I carefully crafted the tone to sound hesitant, slightly apologetic, and desperate to salvage the relationship. I wrote that the recent conflicts had been incredibly painful for me, and that upon deep reflection, I was willing to sit down and finalize the support package. I made it sound as though I was merely seeking a face-saving way to capitulate and return to the family fold. However, I embedded one absolute, non-negotiable condition within the olive branch. I stated that to satisfy my legal counsel and release the funds, Vivian had to bring every single original financial document to Damien's office. She would be required to sign a formal, sworn affidavit right there at the conference table. The affidavit would explicitly swear to the exact intended use of the money, the current status of all her debts, the true ownership of her collateral, and the absolute, unvarnished truthfulness of the paperwork she was providing. If she was genuinely seeking a bridge loan for Reed, as she had publicly claimed, this would be a simple administrative hurdle. If she was running a massive fraud scheme, it would be a legal death sentence. I also requested Theo's presence, phrasing it as a need for a goodwill witness to help heal the rift between us and assure me of the family's unity. Meanwhile, Naomi took on the delicate task of quietly managing Walter. Through a series of highly discreet, untraceable messages, she ensured the silent patriarch remained within our communication loop, keeping him perfectly positioned just out of sight, ready to be called upon when we needed the final undeniable proof to shatter Vivian's reality. Vivian took the bait with astonishing speed. She did not consult an independent lawyer. She did not ask for a delay to thoroughly review my terms. Her supreme arrogance blinded her completely to the inherent danger of a sworn affidavit. She simply saw a naive woman surrendering to her superior will. Less than 2 hours after I hit send, a voicemail appeared on my phone. Vivian's voice dripped with a condescending, victorious sweetness. "My darling," the recording purred smoothly. "I am so incredibly relieved you have finally come to your senses. We all knew you would eventually. This entire ordeal has been so unnecessary and hurtful. We will be at your lawyer's office on Thursday morning, but please, sweetheart, leave the aggressive legal posturing at the door. Do not act like a lawyer. Just come in, be a reasonable future wife, and let us put this ugly business behind us." I deleted the voicemail, feeling a cold, hard smile touch my lips. She truly thought she had won. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray, overcast sky hanging over the city. Damien's law firm was located on the 32nd floor of a sleek glass tower overlooking the harbor. We did not use his standard personal office. Damien had specifically reserved the firm's primary arbitration suite. The setup was an absolute masterpiece of strategic intimidation, masquerading as a standard corporate meeting. The room featured a massive polished granite table and heavy leather chairs, but the true power of the room lay in what Vivian would not immediately notice. Damien had activated the internal, legally compliant video recording system, a standard protocol for depositions and high-stakes mediations, entirely permissible under the clauses printed in tiny font on the visitor log she would have to sign at the reception desk. At the far end of the granite table sat a certified notary public, a quiet professional woman with a heavy official stamp resting beside her legal pad. But we were not alone in the suite. In the adjacent, soundproofed viewing room, separated from us by a thick, frosted glass wall, sat 2 crucial, silent participants. The first was the digital document forensic expert who had originally dismantled Reed's amateur computer file. The second was the senior compliance officer from Bay Ledger Capital. Damien had reached out to him, presenting a small fraction of the evidence we held, and invited him to witness the impending transaction to protect his own firm from absorbing a toxic, fraudulent asset. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the gray waters of the Atlantic, waiting for the receptionist to announce the Hargroves. My heart was beating at a steady, rhythmic pace against my ribs. I felt a strange, profound shift within myself. Just 1 week prior, I would have been trembling at the thought of confronting Vivian, terrified of losing the man I loved, desperate to keep the peace at any cost. But as I heard the heavy double doors of the arbitration suite click open, I realized I was no longer shaking from fear. I was not mourning the end of my engagement anymore. I was shaking with the sheer electric anticipation of a hunter watching the prey step willingly onto the trigger plate. I was about to watch a woman, utterly blinded by her own greed and entirely convinced of her absolute supremacy, sit down and meticulously write out her own confession. She was walking straight into the trap, and because she believed she controlled the world, she was bringing the pen with her. Vivian swept into the arbitration suite at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. She looked like a woman arriving to accept an award. Her tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, her hair perfectly coiffed, and her expression radiated a terrifyingly serene magnanimity. She was here to accept my surrender, and she intended to do it with grace. Theo followed closely behind her, looking tense but hopeful, like a man who believed the storm was finally passing. She did not look at Damien. She looked directly at me, offering a soft, maternal smile that made my stomach turn. She took her seat across the wide granite table, folding her hands neatly over a thick leather folio. "Josephine, darling," Vivian began, her voice a soothing murmur. "I am so glad we could put the misunderstandings behind us. Emotions run high before weddings. It is entirely natural. But we are family, and family always finds a way back to each other." She unzipped the folio and slid a pristine stack of papers across the polished stone surface. On top was a neatly typed promissory note, completely pre-drafted. "I had my people draw this up to save us all some time," Vivian explained, gesturing gracefully toward the document. "It is a standard security agreement. You sign the guarantee. We attach the property details, and the funds for Reed's logistics company are released. It is just a quick formality, sweetheart, and then we can get back to focusing on the floral arrangements and the seating charts. We still have a wedding to save." I did not touch the pen she offered. I looked down at the papers, keeping my posture entirely relaxed, exactly as Damien had coached me. "I am happy to move forward, Vivian," I said, my voice steady and inquisitive. "But since my attorney is present, I just need to clarify a few final details for the record. Just basic due diligence before I put my name on the line." Vivian's smile tightened slightly at the corners, but she nodded. "Of course, darling. Whatever makes you feel secure." "The exact amount requested," I started, looking directly into her eyes. "Can you confirm it for me?" The original discussion was for $45,000, but this document lists a required collateral value of $400,000. The market shifted. "Josephine," Vivian answered smoothly, without missing a beat. "Reed's partners required a larger safety net to unfreeze the primary accounts. It is merely a number on a page to satisfy their underwriters. You will not lose a single dime." "I see," I replied calmly. "And the purpose of these funds is strictly to bridge the operational costs for his firm." "Absolutely," she lied, her voice unwavering. "Strictly business operations. Then why does the urgency suddenly hinge on the end of this month?" I asked, turning a page of the fabricated financial report she had provided. "You mentioned earlier this week that if the paperwork was delayed, everything would collapse. Why the extreme rush for a simple vendor dispute?" Vivian shifted in her heavy leather chair. The maternal warmth was beginning to evaporate, replaced by a thin, brittle layer of annoyance. "Business moves fast, Josephine. Opportunities close. Surely a corporate woman like yourself understands deadlines." "I do," I agreed gently. "Which brings me to the bank confirmation letters you provided. I noticed the dates on the authorization stamps do not align with standard banking days. In fact, one of them falls on a Sunday. Can you explain that discrepancy?" The air in the room grew noticeably colder. Vivian's hands were no longer folded peacefully. They were gripping the edge of the granite table. She shot a sharp, irritated glance at Damien, then back at me. "Clerical errors happen, Josephine," Vivian snapped, her tone finally losing its sweet veneer. "You are missing the forest for the trees. The point is, the funds are needed immediately. In fact, to avoid any further complications with the current lenders who are holding the accounts, it would be best if you simply dated your signature for the 15th of last month. It keeps the timeline clean for their internal audits. It prevents them from panicking." Damien, who had been sitting silently taking notes, suddenly stopped writing. I kept my face blank, though my pulse roared in my ears. She had just verbally requested that I backdate a legal financial document to deceive a lending institution. It was a textbook definition of fraud, stated clearly into the microphones embedded in the ceiling. "Backdating a legal document is a significant risk," I said, leaning forward slightly. "It makes me wonder about our long-term financial structure. After the wedding, Theo and I will be legally bound. Are we expected to merge our assets to continuously solve these types of debts? Is my property going to be permanently absorbed into the family portfolio to manage these liabilities?" Vivian scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet room. She threw her hands up in exasperation, completely abandoning the peacemaker persona. "What exactly do you think marriage is, Josephine?" Vivian demanded, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "Do you think it is just holding hands and taking vacations? It is an institution. What is marriage for, if not to combine the strongest assets of both sides to protect the family name? You bring equity, we bring legacy. That is how the world works. You're acting like a petulant child hoarding her allowance." I did not answer her. I did not need to. I simply shifted my gaze to Theo. Theo was staring at his mother as if she had suddenly mutated into a monster right in front of him. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw hung slightly slack. For months, he had fiercely defended her, believing her actions were rooted in desperate maternal love and familial loyalty. But hearing her say it out loud, hearing her explicitly define our impending marriage as nothing more than a mechanism to absorb my assets, completely shattered his conditioned reality. He finally saw the cold, mechanical financial trap I had recognized weeks ago. Vivian misread the silence. She thought she was losing control of the negotiation, so she resorted to her favorite weapon, sheer terror. She leaned across the table, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. Her eyes were wide, burning with malicious intent. "Let me make this crystal clear for you," Vivian hissed, her voice low and threatening. "If you back out of this now, if you play your little lawyer games and refuse to sign, I will make sure everyone in Boston knows exactly who you are. I will tell the partners at Astor Point Advisory that you are mentally unstable and prone to hysterical, vindictive episodes. I will tell our entire social circle that you selfishly destroyed a wedding and ripped a family apart over petty cash. I will ruin your professional reputation. Josephine, you will be toxic." "Now, sign the paper." "I believe we have heard enough," Damien interrupted, his voice cutting through the heavy tension like a steel blade. He reached across the table and pulled the sworn affidavit Vivian had signed right when she walked in, the one verifying the absolute truth of her documents, toward himself. He pressed a button on the intercom console. The side door of the arbitration suite opened. The notary public, who had been sitting quietly in the corner the entire time, stepped forward. She formally stamped the affidavit, authenticating Vivian's signature and her sworn oath under penalty of perjury. Then, the door to the viewing room opened. The digital forensic expert walked in, holding a red folder. He did not look at Vivian. He addressed Damien directly. "I have reviewed the physical files presented today against the digital metadata we extracted earlier this week," the expert stated clearly. "The bank stamps are confirmed digital overlays. The property assessment values have been manually altered. The entire financial profile presented for the logistics company is a complete fabrication." Vivian froze. The threatening finger she had pointed at me slowly curled back into a trembling fist. Her eyes darted wildly between Damien, the expert, and the blinking red recording light she had finally noticed on the wall console. Before she could formulate a defense, the main double doors of the suite pushed open. Walter Hargrove walked slowly into the room. He looked older than he ever had, completely drained of life. In his hand, he carried a large, thick manila envelope. He walked past his wife without making eye contact and placed the envelope gently on the granite table in front of me. "That is the original, certified demand letter from the secondary lenders, dated 2 days ago," Walter said, his voice a dry, hollow rasp. "The Back Bay house is facing imminent foreclosure. The outstanding debt is nearly $800,000. There is no logistics company crisis. There never was." He finally turned to look at Vivian. She was staring at him in absolute paralyzed horror. The man she had controlled for decades had just delivered the kill shot to her elaborate illusion. "It is over, Vivian," Walter whispered. "Stop talking." Vivian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked down at the forged documents, then up at the notary, then at the camera. The crushing realization crashed down upon her. She was no longer a wealthy matriarch bullying a frightened bride in a private living room. She was sitting in a recorded legal environment, having just committed extortion, confessed to attempted fraud, and sworn under oath to a fabricated financial narrative. She had not walked into a negotiation. She had walked straight into a meticulously constructed vault, and she had just handed us the combination. Damien stood up, the legs of his heavy leather chair scraping sharply against the polished hardwood floor. He did not raise his voice. He simply delivered the final blow with absolute, terrifying calm. "This meeting is concluded," Damien stated, looking directly into Vivian's panicked eyes. "Every single piece of paper on this granite table, including the sworn affidavit you just signed under oath, along with the audio and video recordings of your explicit threats and your direct request to backdate a financial document, are now strictly preserved. They will serve as primary evidence for the legal actions commencing immediately." The representative from Bay Ledger Capital stepped out of the viewing room, his face a tight mask of corporate disgust. He informed Vivian, in a tone completely devoid of sympathy, that her refinancing application was permanently terminated. Furthermore, because she had officially submitted my name and my property as a guarantor without any legal authorization or prior consent, her entire portfolio was being forwarded directly to their internal fraud compliance department. Within 1 hour of leaving the arbitration suite, I sat at my desk and drafted the official, irrevocable cancellation of the wedding. I did not send it just to Theo. I copied the wedding planner, the venue coordinator, the caterers, and the entire bridal party. I left absolutely zero room for Vivian to spin a false narrative of a temporary lover's quarrel, or use the lingering ambiguity of an engagement to buy herself more social leverage. The bridge was completely burned, the ashes scattered to the wind. Damien did not hesitate to strike while the iron was scorching hot. By the end of that exact same week, he filed a devastating civil lawsuit in the Suffolk County court system. He targeted her with surgical, merciless precision. The branches of the suit were explicitly clear intentional infliction of emotional distress, targeted defamation of character, resulting in severe professional damage at Astor Point Advisory, and fraudulent misrepresentation during high-stakes financial negotiations. Concurrently, he forwarded the entire bundle of forged bank statements, the manually altered property assessments, and the perjured affidavit to the district attorney's office for a formal review. The Hargrove family structure, a delicate house of cards built entirely on Vivian's iron-fisted control and manufactured prestige, collapsed inward with breathtaking speed. Reed, terrified by the very real prospect of facing felony charges for digital document forgery, turned on his mother almost instantly. During his preliminary legal deposition, he completely abandoned his arrogant, entitled posturing. He testified under oath that Vivian had relentlessly pressured him into generating the fake financial portfolio. He explicitly stated that she forced him to create the beautiful numbers to save her own face and earn a few more months of breathing room before the bank seized their home. He threw her to the wolves to save his own skin. Then came Theo. 2 weeks after the disastrous meeting, he walked into Damien's law office. He looked like a hollow ghost of the confident architect I had agreed to marry. He placed his personal phone on the desk, unlocking it to reveal the saved draft of the fake text message his mother had intended to send from a burner number. He formally offered to testify against her in open court. He had finally chosen the truth, but his sudden awakening arrived far too late to salvage what we had. The trust was already pulverized. The pivotal mediation session felt less like a negotiation and more like an execution. Vivian sat across from us, stripped entirely of her sapphire silk dresses and her terrifyingly serene smiles. She wore a plain gray suit, looking shrunken, exhausted, and remarkably old. On the table between us, Damien laid out the inescapable trap. On the left side sat the original, terrifying foreclosure notices Walter had bravely provided. On the right side sat the brightly colored, fabricated cash flow charts she had sworn were completely real. In the exact center lay a printed transcript of her threatening to ruin my career if I did not sign away my inheritance. Vivian had absolutely nowhere left to run. Her high-priced defense attorney advised her to settle immediately rather than face a highly publicized trial that would end in certain public ruin and potential jail time. The formidable, caring mother facade was violently ripped away. Her denials were pathetically weak. Reduced to breathless, tearful whispers about family loyalty that not a single person in the room believed anymore. The final legal settlement was brutal and absolute. Vivian was forced to sign a legally binding public retraction, entirely clearing my name of any wrongdoing, emotional instability, or selfishness, which Damien immediately forwarded to the senior managing partners at my firm to restore my professional standing. She was placed under a strict permanent no-contact order. She was compelled to pay substantial financial restitution for the non-refundable deposits of the canceled wedding and the legal fees I incurred defending myself against her smear campaign. But the most devastating penalty was the one not written in the court documents. The pristine, untouchable social facade she had worshipped her entire life was completely annihilated. Boston society is incredibly small and fiercely ruthless. Within a month, her name was quietly erased from every single charity board, gala invitation, and country club guest list in the city. As I walked out of the mediation center that final afternoon, Theo was waiting by the heavy revolving doors. He stepped into my path, his dark eyes pleading and filled with a desperate, crushing sorrow. "Josephine, please," Theo said, his voice thick with regret. "It is finally over. She cannot hurt us anymore. I see exactly who she is now. We can start over, just the two of us, completely separate from my parents. Please give me one more chance." I looked at him, feeling a dull ache in my chest for the dream I had lost. But my vision was perfectly, undeniably clear. "It was never just about your mother, Theo," I replied softly, my voice steady. "It was about the fact that you watched me stand entirely alone for months. You let me become the villain because it was easier than facing the ugly truth about your own family. You allowed me to be treated as a recoverable asset, a financial life raft, and you fiercely defended the people trying to sink me. I cannot build a marriage on a foundation where I'm expected to rescue my husband from his own life." I walked past him, stepping out into the bright, crisp afternoon air, leaving him standing alone in the lobby. Judge Naomi Mercer was waiting for me at the bottom of the wide stone steps of the Boston courthouse. The cold wind tugged at her heavy wool coat, but she stood as rigid and imposing as ever. She looked at me, a rare, genuine softness appearing in her sharp, analytical eyes. "You did remarkably well, Josephine," Naomi said, her voice carrying over the noise of the city traffic. "I know it hurts right now, but you must understand. My advice to you all those months ago was never meant to teach you not to believe in love." She reached out and briefly, warmly squeezed my hand. "My advice was simply this," Naomi continued, a proud smile touching her lips. "Always force greed to write its own confession, because once it is on paper, it can never hide in the shadows of romance again." I smiled back, a small, weary, but fiercely triumphant smile. I walked away from the courthouse alone. I carried a heavy grief for the future I had violently lost, but I walked with my head held high. I had preserved my career, I had protected my grandmother's legacy, and I had kept my honor completely intact. But most importantly, I had secured the greatest victory of all, the absolute, undeniable right not to become a financial bailout wrapped in the shape of a bride. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. And please let me know in the comments where you are listening to this from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.